Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about significant figures in calculations. So depending if you add or subtract, multiply or divide, or maybe you have to do multi-step calculations where maybe you have to add and then multiply or so forth, so forth. So I'm going to teach you the rules first and we'll do lots of examples. If you have a calculator handy, I'm going to teach you also today how to use the exponent key. And if you have a graphing calculator, I'll show you where that button is, or a scientific calculator. They have buttons in all different locations. So we'll go through where those buttons possibly could be for your calculator. So the first step is let's look at the rules for first adding and subtracting. So for Sig Figs calculations, as you see in the example, when you are adding and subtracting, the rule for Sig Figs, it's the least after the decimal. And it's not really Sig Figs, it's actual digits after the decimal. So I teach my students when they're first starting this to, when they're adding and subtracting, line up the decimals. So you don't have to, but if you need to in the beginning, go ahead. So if I had 5.74, 0.823, and 2.651, I'm going to line up those decimals, okay, and just use a calculator, plug it in. And as you see, this very first example right here has 2 after the decimal. This one has 3 after the decimal, and this one also has 3 after the decimal. So the rule is the least after the decimal. So when you add this up, wherever it is that you need to cut it off, then cut it off. So 9.214, because only 2 after the decimal, then you have 9.21, okay? I'm going to talk about rounding also in this video, but for now, this is not a number that needed to be rounded, so we'll just go from there, okay? So the examples that we're going to do right here, I'm going to plug them in. Like I said, if you need to line up the decimals, go right ahead. So I'm going to do A with you, and then the rest we'll just go ahead and plug in. So 0.987, excuse me, 125.1, and then 1.22. Okay, so when I add this in, and 1.22, okay, you should get about 127.307. Okay, so when I look at my decimals that I see right here, I have 3 after the decimal, I have 1 after, and I also have these 2 that are after the decimal. Now the rule is the least after the decimal, so I'm going to cut right here. Okay, sorry, my line is definitely not a line. And because I only need 1 after the decimal, that's what I need, so I'm going to cut it off right there. Okay, like I said, we'll talk about rounding when it gets to it, but for that answer right there, 127.3. Okay, the next one, part B, we have 5.98, and then we have minus 3.449, and then minus 0.765. Okay, so when I plug that in the calculator, this is what you should get, 1.766. And when you're doing these problems in the beginning, if it helps you to write down what the calculator says, that's fine. But in the end, don't do that, because it's gonna waste some time when you're doing calculations, especially if it's a test or quiz or AP test. You're gonna want to make sure you save as much time as possible. But right now, we're just learning the rules. Right here I have 2 after the decimal, this number I have 3, and then this one also I have 3. So because this first number has 2 after the decimal, I'm going to keep only 2 after the decimal, but I'm going to cut my answer right there. Now this is where we can talk about rounding, okay? I have a simple rule with rounding, and it works on the AP test also, okay? Basically, if it's 5 or higher, then round the number up. And what I mean by 5 or higher is that the number after where you're going to cut, so this number right here, if it is 5 or higher, so 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, then round the number up. So instead of 1.76, I'm going to have actually 1.77, okay? There's always been a general rule that the last digit can always be off by 1, and that's simply because of a term called estimated digit. So if you did not round and it should have been rounded, it's okay, because you're allowed to be off by 1 number. But this one I think should have been evident to you that you would have rounded that digit. Part C, let me plug it in. So we got 2.18 and 5.621 and 1.5870 plus 2. And when you plug that in, the calculator tells you about 11.388. Now, as you're doing this, you have a number 2 after the decimal. This one has 3 after, and this one has 4 after. Now remember, it's not, when adding subtracting, it's not really about sig figs, it's about digits after the decimal. So 0.5870, so I see 4. But this number right here, there's nothing after the decimal. So I have to follow the rule, the least after the decimal, which means this number is going to dictate the rule. So my answer can't have anything after the decimal. So I'm going to cut it right there after that 11 point. So the answer simply is just 11. Okay. The last one, part D, 7.876, and then minus 12.56, and then plus 123.792. Now, it doesn't matter if you're adding and subtracting at the same time, because adding and subtracting has the same rule. So same thing, you still got to look at what's after the decimal. So this one has 3 after, this one has 2, and then this one also has 3. So the least after the decimal is 2. So in the calculator, you get 119.108. And I'm going to only have 2 after the decimal, which means I'm going to cut right there. And I got to look at that number after the 0 because it is an 8, which means I need to round this number up. So instead of being 119.10, it's going to be actually 119.11. Okay? So hopefully that was clear to you. We're going to do some more examples as we go through the video, but we're going to look at the rules for multiply and divide first. Okay? Multiply and divide have a different rule where they look at the number of sig figs between every number. So it has nothing to do with anything after the decimal. It means every single sig fig. So I gave you an example right here where I have 5.02, and when I teach my students this in the beginning, I tell them it's helpful if when you're doing the numbers, actually put how many sig figs, and you could abbreviate sig figs as F, that's fine, how many sig figs are actually under each digit. So 5.02, I see 3 sig figs. Remember that 0 in the middle, it counts because it's a captive 0. It's between a 5 and a 2. 89.665, that's 5 sig figs. And this last one, I know some students in the beginning would be like, well, that's 3 sig figs, but it's not, because remember this 0 in the front, that's a leading 0, and leading zeros don't count as sig figs. But the 0 at the end, called a trailing 0, does count because remember there's 2 parts to that rule. Number 1, it has to follow an actual non-zero digit, which it follows a 1, and that has to contain a decimal, which it does. So these are the 2 sig figs that count. So between 3, 5, and 2, this one has 2 sig figs, which means my answer can only have 2 sig figs. So if the calculator tells you 45.0 something, doesn't matter, we're going to cut it off right there and have only an answer of 45. Okay? Dividing has the same rule, and doesn't matter if you multiply or divide in the same problem, you still have to follow the rules. So part A, we're going to be multiplying, so 1.01. And if you want to pause and try it yourself and then unpause and check your answers, I think that's great. So that way you're not just seeing what I'm solving. It really helps to actually plug it in and see it firsthand also. So I have 1.01, 0.12, and then 53. So I see 3 sig figs here, I see 2 sig figs, and I see 4. Okay? And because this one right here has the least sig figs, my answer can only have 2. So the calculator says 6.4854, and I'm just going to go ahead and stop writing there because there was more digits. But my answer is only going to have 2 sig figs. So I'm going to cut it right here. And because this number 4, the digit after it is greater than 5, I'm going to round that 4 up. So 6.5. Okay? The next one, I see 56.55, and I'm going to divide that by 0.920. Okay? So once I plug it in, then I got to figure out how many sig figs am I going to have. So this first number, I see 4 sig figs, and this second number, I see 3 sig figs. This 0 in the front doesn't count, because remember it's a leading 0, but the 0 at the end does count because it follows a 2, and it contains a decimal. So my answer when I plug this in is 61.467, and I'm just going to stop writing the rest of it because I only need 3 sig figs. So 1, 2, 3, I'm going to cut my sig figs after that 4, and same thing, the number after that 4, if it's 5 or higher, then round it up. So it contains 61.5. Part C, I see 1.10 and then multiply it by 0.5112. And then when it comes to doing more than one operation at the same time, don't do anything to the number in the calculator. Just keep it flowing. Don't cut it. Don't round it. Just put it in, hit equals, and then now divide. So I don't even care about Sig Figs until after I've done all my calculations. So I plugged in the multiplication. I hit enters, and then divide 1.5870. And now I see a big number. Okay. Well, as in a big number, as in a long number. So I see 3 Sig Figs here. That 0 counts because the decimal and the 1. I see 3 Sig Figs here. The Sig Fig does not matter. And then 1.5870, the Sig Fig at 0 does count because it follows that 7 and it contains a decimal. So regardless, I still need 3 Sig Figs. So in my calculator, I see 0.35488, and I'm just going to stop writing there. And I only need 3 Sig Figs, so 1, 2, 3. I'm going to cut it there. And I got to look at that number after the 4. So 0.355, okay? Same thing for the last one, 4.562, and then multiply 3.9987. And then I'm going to hit enter, equal, enter, whatever one your calculator says, and then I'm going to go divide 98.5, okay? Not even concerned with rounding or Sig Figs till after I plugged everything in. So this first number has 4 Sig Figs. This last one, every digit matters because of that decimal, and the 0 follows the 7, so I see 6 Sig Figs. And then this last one, I see 3. So I need my answer to contain 3 Sig Figs, so it's a long number, 0.20382, and we'll stop there. And then I only need 3 Sig Figs, so 0.203, I'm going to cut it right there, and then the number after 3, I got to round it up. So 0.204, okay? As you go through this, you don't have to write this beginning step of the answer. It's just only till you get the hang of it, okay? As you go through each chapter, Sig Figs do not disappear. So you got to make sure that you not only know how to figure out Sig Figs, but how to figure out adding, subtracting rules, and then multiply and divide rules, okay? So here's some more examples on here. And I threw in some units. Now I'm going to do another video that I'm going to talk about not only what units are, but how to convert units, okay? So this very first one, we're going to perform the calculations. I'm just going to plug it in and make sure your answer has the correct Sig Figs and the correct units, okay? So I'm going to write a little bit of notes over here too, in case you have not seen that video yet. So part A, I'm going to add, so 1.2 plus 2.35. And my answer in the calculator, I only need, according to adding rules, I only need 1 after the decimal, okay? So my answer says 3.55, but I only need 1 after the decimal. The number after the 5 is a 5, so I'm going to round it up. Now some students get iffy with that number 5. It doesn't matter. The last digit is an estimated digit. That's fine. 5, 6, either one is fine. Okay? Now, let's talk about units real quick. That little m, that's meters. And anytime units, you add or subtract. They have to be the same units. So if we do come to a problem where we have to convert something, then we'll convert it. But like I said, there is a video on here that you can see called units, and then I think there's one also called converting units. So I have meters plus meters, so my answer 3.6 and then little m. Okay. dm is called decimeter, and I have 5.681, and I'm going to subtract just 2. So for this one, I don't need anything after the decimal because this number 2 doesn't have anything after the decimal. So the calculator says 3.681, and I have decimeters minus decimeter, but I need nothing after the decimal. So I'm going to cut it right there, but that number 3 is a 6, so I need to round that 3 up to 4. So 4 decimeters. 25 centimeters plus 3 centimeters. I don't think we need a calculator for that. For 28. Both of them have the same units. And for both of those same units, centimeters. And neither one of them have anything after the decimal. So I don't need to add anything after the decimal. I get students sometimes that ask, well, do I need to put a decimal? It's not needed. Okay, if you put it, don't put it. Same thing as long as you don't put anything after the decimal. I have centimeters minus centimeters, and right here I see 4 after the decimal, and this one I only see 1. So I'm going to plug this in, and then minus that 56, 84, 26.1. Okay, and I only need 1 after the decimal. So 291252, and then 0.1. The number after the 1 is a 3. Don't need to put it because I only need 1 after the decimal. Now we're going to do a little multiply and divide. So part E, we got to remember when we are multiplying and dividing, it's the least sig figs overall. So right here I see 4 sig figs, and right here I see 5. So when I plug in 68.23 divide 38.255, I only need 4 sig figs. So I get 1.78355, and I'm just going to write a couple more. And that 1.783, I'm going to cut it right there. And that number 3 has a 5 after it, so I'm going to round that 3 up to a 4. So 1.784. Now let's talk a little bit about units when you multiply and divide. So units, when you multiply or divide, they don't have to be the same. You may see some units that because you have the same unit twice, so that means it could be squared, or in this case we have hectometer, that's what the H stands for, hectometer, divide by hectometer, and if you write that on here, hectometer divide by hectometer, well, you're going to see they cancel out. So if they are the same unit dividing, well, in this case, then we don't have any units. But what if we would have been multiplying here instead? So if I would have had HM multiplied by HM, well, then I have HM squared, not 2 times HM. So HM times HM is HM squared. In this case, we have nothing after the units because we divided. So they don't have to be the same. I could have had a hectometer multiplied by a meter. Then that means it's not squared. They didn't cancel out. You have both units. And there should be an example coming up like that. Part F, we're going to multiply. So 0.28524 times 0.25124, and then multiply 1.235. Okay. As you see in here, I have 5 sig figs here. I have 5 and I have 4. Remember, leading zeros do not count as sig figs. So when I plug this in the calculator, 0.088504, and I only need 4 sig figs, so I'm going to cut it right there. And I have meters times meters times meters. So that means I have meters cubed. And when you write meters cubed, the 3 is an exponent. So 0.0885, and then meters, oops, sorry, I'm in my video there. 0.0885, well, I need 4 sig figs. Oops, I drew my line in the wrong spot. I need that 0 right there. The zeros in the front do not count as sig figs because they're leading zeros. So 0.08850, and then meters cubed. Okay? So that is what happens when you multiply or divide units. Okay? I got a couple more examples on here. So like I said, if you want to pause the video, try them yourself, and then check your answers. Okay? So part G, I'm going to take centimeters times centimeters. So 2.6538, and I'm going to multiply by 2.1. And I get, right here I have 5 sig figs, and right here I have 2 sig figs. So I only need 2 sig figs. My calculator says at least 5.57, so I know I got to cut right there. So I'm going to round that number 5. I'm going to round it up because the number is a 7 after it. So 5.6, and I have centimeters times centimeters. So I'm going to have centimeters squared. Part H, I am dividing, and I'm going to plug it in first, 3845.2, and then divide 25.2354. Okay, so when I plug this in, first sig figs, I have 5 sig figs here, and right here I have 6. Okay, so when I divide, I need 5 sig figs. So 152.37. The number after the 7 is a 3, so I know I'm going to cut right there. But what happens to units? Well, if you need to, do it over here. I have meters cubed divide by meters. Well, if you can't figure this out, another way to do this is if you have meters times meters times meters, okay? And meters times meters times meters, divide by meters. So meters times meters times meters, divide by meters. So basically one of these meters are going to cancel, and I have 2 meters left. So that means I have meters times meters, which means this is meters squared. All right, for part I see I have 1.2 meters, and I'm going to multiply that by 2, so I don't think I need to plug that in the calculator. So it looks like it's 2.4. But this number 2 doesn't have anything after the decimal. So instead of it being 2.4, it's just going to be 2. Now I have meters times meters squared. So I'm now going to have meters cubed. 5.3 multiplied by 5.2398 multiplied by 2. So I see I have 2 sig figs here. I have 5 here, and I have 1 here. So I don't need any value besides just 1 sig fig. So the calculator says 55.54. We'll just keep going because I only need 1 sig fig. So I'm going to be cutting it right here. But this number 5, there's a 5 after it. Okay, and my general rule is if it's 5 or higher, you round up. And I know this seems like big time rounding too, because it's like 55, now you got 60. That's big rounding. And it is big rounding. We don't usually see something like this, especially in AP. We don't ever do 1 sig fig in the calculation. But in this case, it came out to be 1 sig fig. And I have meters times meters times meters, and then meters cubed. Okay. Part K, it looks like I'm dividing, so 1254.1 divide by 100. So it's simply just moving the decimal 2 places. So this one right here, I have 5 sig figs, but this 100, there's no decimal, which means I only have 1 sig fig. Okay. So the number divided by 100, and you're going to get, it's just moving the decimal 2 places. But I only need 2 sig figs. So you're going to get 12.541, but we're going to cut it right there. Okay, so I can have that 1 sig fig. And the answer is not 1, because the calculator said 12 something. So you got to keep the value still in the tens place. So now instead of that 2, we're just going to put a 0 instead. Now don't put a decimal, because then that means that 0 will become significant. So it's going to be 10. And then centimeters divide by centimeters. Now the units have canceled, so I have no units. And the very last one, 45.23547 minus 20.584. And now because I'm subtracting, I not only need the units to be the same, but now I got to look at what's after the decimal. So this first number, I have 5 after the decimal, and this one I have 3. So after I plug it in, I get 24.65147, and I have grams, because they have to be the same unit when you add and subtract, and I have 5 after versus 3. So I have my 3 sig figs right there. I'm going to cut it, and I don't need to round because the numbers are 4, and I'll get 24.651 grams. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. And if you need some more practice, you'll see some more coming in the video. Okay, so what if you have to do scientific notation? Okay, and this usually takes me almost about a day to figure out everyone's calculator with my students, because we all have different calculators. I usually use a graphing calculator, but in my honors class, they usually use a scientific calculator. So as you see on the screen here, I'm going to go one slide further so that way we can find your button. Okay? Oops. Don't want to give the answer yet. So usually with the scientific calculator, most students get a Texas Instrument one, as you see right here, and also this blue one right here. And you have to find a certain button that works for your calculator. And it's either called the double E button or EXP. Most students have that one. Even graphing calculators have the EE button. So if your calculator looks like this, Texas Instrument, and I think it's Texas Instrument 30, your EE button is right here above the 7. Yeah, that's a 7. Or if you have a Texas Instrument that looks like this, your EXP button could be down here at the bottom. But I have seen students that have either a Casio or a Texas Instrument where they don't have an EE button or an EXP, but they do have a button that says times 10 to the N, and that's fine too. I've seen it also somewhere over here in the middle. It just depends on your calculator. So please find your button, and then we're going to go back and plug in that calculation. If you do have a graphing calculator, you do have the EE button, but if you notice, it's the comma button. But in order for you to get to that EE button, you got to hit the second function, and your second function is usually this top button that's right up here. This calculator's yellow, mine is blue. Either way, every graphing calculator has that second button right there at the top. And then hit second button and then the comma, and then you'll see that EE pop up. And as you see in the calculator, it looks just like this. So I'm going to go back to that example. I'm going to go through the rules real quick. Okay? So when you plug this in, the exponents do not have to be the same. You just basically plug in the calculator. But when you plug it in, you have to plug it in very specific. So what I did was I typed out the rules on how to plug this in. So if you have the EXP button, you would type in 4.5, and this part right here, that is the button. That's your EXP. It's the exponent button. So the times 10 is that button. So don't plug in times 10, just hit your EXP button or EE button, and then put -5. Now -5, usually in most calculators, okay, so you got your screen right there. Usually the negative button, it sits right here next to like the 1, 2, 3 and the 0. It's not over here because that's your subtract button. So usually the negative button is usually at the bottom of the calculator. So 4.5, hit your E button, -5, and we're going to be dividing, so hit your divide button, and then 1.6, and you got to hit that E button again. So exponent, -2. So this is when you plug it into the calculator, it should look something like this, okay? And we'll get to the answer in just a second. Some calculators, you may have to use parentheses, and especially their Texas Instrument calculators, they're like a blue and white type of calculator. They definitely need the parentheses with them. So if you have to use the times 10 button, so that button at the bottom, if you don't have the EXP or the EE button, if you have that times 10 to the N button, then this is the button that you have to hit. So with parentheses, same thing, 4.5, and you hit that special button of yours, okay, and then -5, and then in parentheses, divide, and then put the next number in parentheses also. So hit your button and then -2. Okay, I typed it out a different way also because I've seen students where they use what's called the upside down V button. It's called the caret button. They can do it that way too. Honestly, like I said, it takes me about a day to go around every student to make sure they know where their specific button is. So it could be this button, it could be the caret button, and usually this caret button on my calculator, it's over here by like the divide button. It looks like just like a little upside down V. So if you plug it in the calculator, it looks just like this. So in the calculator, when you plug this in, you get this value. Now here comes Sig Figs. I'm dividing. 4.5, 1.6. We never look at the exponent for Sig Figs because that's how much the decimal was moved, not how many zeros you have. So I have 4.5, which has 2 Sig Figs, and I have 1.6, which has 2 Sig Figs. So my answer just needs to have 2 Sig Figs. So this right here, when I round this number, I'm going to cut it right there, and then 0.0028. If you need it to be in scientific notation, that's fine. I already did a video with that if you need some help. Basically, the decimal gets moved until you hit a number between 1 and 9. So if you had to go scientific notation, you start with your decimal and go 1, 2, 3. And you just move that decimal in between every number. And as long as you hit a number, what number in the front is called a coefficient, between 1 and 9.9, you stop moving your decimal. Because I moved my decimal to the right, my exponent is negative. And the 3 just means I moved my decimal 3 places. So 2.8 times 10 to the -3. Okay? Let's try one together. Like I said, those are your buttons right there. And let's try this one. What if now we had to multiply? Okay, so I'm going to write it out so that way you know how to plug it in your calculator, assuming that you have the EE button or the EXP. If you have that times 10 button that looks kind of like this, then use that also. So right here, remember that's our special button. We don't need to plug that in. And same thing right here, times 10, we don't need to plug it in. So that's going to be our button right there. And we are going to be multiplying. Now, if your calculator doesn't have to have parentheses, then that's fine. So I'm going to plug it in, and let's see if we get the same thing. So 2.8, hit my E button, and then to the third, okay, so just plug in a 3, and then I'm going to multiply 5.1, hit my E button, and then that was -7. Okay, so when I plug this in, I'm going to get a small number, 0.001428. Okay, now here comes Sig Figs. This number in the front has 2 Sig Figs, and 5.1 has 2 Sig Figs. So I only need 2 Sig Figs. These zeros right here do not count because they're leading zeros. Okay, so it doesn't matter to me. They're just placeholders. But the 1 and the 4 do matter. Those are Sig Figs. So I'm going to cut my answer right there. So in the end, 0.0014, and then that would be my answer. Okay. If your numbers don't have any units, you don't need to put any units. If they had units, you need to make sure you include those units. Okay. So I put in here the rules for rounding, just so that way you see them live in effect, because we're going to talk about a multi-step calculation. So anytime you plug numbers in, just plug them in. Don't worry about Sig Figs or rounding till at the very end. So as you see right here in a multi-step calculation, leave the rounding to the end. So what happens is if you have to add and then you have to multiply and then maybe subtract, if you did Sig Figs every single step and rounded, your number is going to be so beyond far away from that answer than it was supposed to be. Okay, so the rule is just don't worry about that to the very end. So if you have to round, just quick, simple rule, if the number after where you have to count, if the number after where you have to cut is 5 or higher, then round the number up. If it's below that, as in like 1, 2, 3, 4, then just don't round it. So if I had a number 45.87, all of these digits in the front, even before the decimal and after the decimal, they're all certain values. But that's why I said at the very end, that last digit is the estimated number. Maybe you rounded to 2, maybe that person kept it at 2, or you rounded it to 3. It's always the estimated digit. And in my class, and just like the AP test, you're always allowed to be off by 1. Okay, so don't stress about the rounding. Just round when you need to, and if you don't need to round, then don't round. Okay, so in here, I want to practice also, before we get to the multi-step, when you need to round something to only 4 Sig Figs. Okay, so I kept the rule right there. Higher than 5, round it up. Below 5, leave it alone. Okay, so if I only want 4 Sig Figs, you always start from the beginning, and I always teach my students, just draw a line until you hit that Sig Figs that you want. So 167.7, there's 4 Sig Figs, and I'm going to cut right there. The number after the 7 is higher than 5, so I'm going to round that 7 up. So 167.8. Part B, not one of these zeros count because these are leading zeros, so I'm not even going to underline them, but I'm going to start on the 4 and count 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm sorry. 4, 5, 6, 9. There's my 4 Sig Figs, and that's where I'm going to cut. Now, I don't need to round because the number after the 9 is a 2. Now, I have a rule about zeros. If you have more than 3 zeros, don't write all those zeros. Write it in scientific notation. And in the beginning, you may not notice that, but as we go through the course, you're going to be like, oh, this number, I need to do it in scientific notation. So if I have 4, 5, 6, 9, and I need to just move this decimal, so 1 place, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I'm going to stop my decimal there because the number in front of scientific notation needs to be a number between 1 and 9. And I got 4.5. and then times 10. And because I moved my decimal 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, I moved it 5 places. The question is it positive or negative? I moved my decimal to the right, and because I moved it to the right, my exponent is negative. Okay? 23.005 or 00567, that 23, I see 2 sig figs, and plus these zeros count because they're captive zeros. But I'm going to cut right there, and the number after that 0 is a 5. So I'm going to round that 0 to 1. So 23.01. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's my 4 sig figs. I'm going to cut right there. And 3.45. Now because the number 6 has a 7 after it, so I'm going to round that 6 to a 7. And 7903, there's my 4 sig figs right there. And I'm going to cut. The number after 3 is a 0. And if you have something that doesn't have anything after the decimal, then don't stress about it. It has nothing after the decimal. Okay? At 11.044, I'm going to take my sig figs, start in the beginning. I'm going to cut right there. So 11.04. Okay? So easy enough. So the reason why I did that is because we're going to do the next thing. We're going to do a multi-step calculation. And I want you to see when the rounding comes into play. So when you are doing multi-steps, you need to remember back from math class, you probably learned it in algebra, maybe 8th grade, orders of operation. You really need to make sure that you're doing the calculations in a certain order. So we always say P for parentheses, always do the parentheses first. Multiply, divide, add, and then subtract. There is also another one like exponents. If you actually have exponents, exponents happen before the parentheses. But usually in chemistry, we don't really deal with that, but we do deal with parentheses more than the exponents. So parentheses first, multiply, divide, add, and subtract. Okay? Don't look at sig figs or rounding to the final answer. Okay? So the reason why I mention this is something like this. What if you had, let's say, a number, you had 2 numbers that you were subtracting, but then it said multiply by like a different number, okay? I always get students to say, well, I got to multiply by first because I see multiplication happens before subtracting. And they're absolutely right. However, these 2 values right here were in parentheses. You have to do parentheses first. Even though what you're doing in the parentheses is subtracting, you still have to do the parentheses first. So this has to still be your first step, and then you multiply. That's your second step, okay? So I believe I have a couple examples where we have a multi-step. So right here, perform the following calculations. Make sure you have correct sig figs and units in the end. Okay, and if you want to pause it, try it yourself, and then check your answers at the end. So I have a parentheses that is multiplied, and I'm going to add it to another parentheses. So I have to do this parentheses part first. So I'm just going to make a note. So my first step, I have to do the parentheses part. And it doesn't matter which one you do because you have to do both of them. So this very first one, 3.45 times 2.70, okay? And I get a number, 9.314. And I have centimeters, but now I have centimeters times centimeters. So I have centimeters squared. And like I said, I'm not worried about sig figs or any of that to the very end. So I have this value, and then I have 7.433 multiply 1.677. Okay, and then in this one, and I know sometimes it gets a little tedious writing down every single thing that the calculator says, but until you get the hang of it, your teacher, probably in your math class, or I would teach you a button on your calculator called second answer, to where you don't have to write it down, what you have in the calculator. You could actually use it and then keep using it and keep using it. So in another video, I'll show you how to do that also. So because it's centimeters times centimeters, I'm going to have centimeters squared. Okay? So now here comes the adding. So I'm going to take these 2 numbers, I'm going to add them together. And when you're adding units, you need to make sure that the units are the same. So I do have centimeters, and then centimeters squared over here, centimeters squared, and I'm going to be adding that. So now here comes my final answer. I will have centimeters squared, but now here comes the sig figs. I'm adding. And because of adding the least after the decimal, I have 3 here after the decimal, and this one I have a whole bunch after the decimal. So I know my answer needs to have 3 sig figs after the decimal. So in the beginning, 19, and then plus that 12, so you're going to get that 21. And then I only need 3 after the decimal. So my calculator says 0.780, and the number after the 0 is a 1, so I don't need to write it. So that is what your answer would be. Okay? So even though there are Sig Fig rules for multiplying, if you round it and then round this one and cut it because of Sig Figs, your answer is going to be too far away from the actual true value. In a video coming up, I'm going to teach you what's called percent error. So you're actually going to see how much of a difference it makes. Right here, part B, I am taking grams, that's what little g is, and I'm going to be dividing by all of this stuff that's in parentheses, and all of this stuff in parentheses is multiply. So I have to do this part first because it's in parentheses. So I'm going to take that 1.376 and multiply by 2.45, and then multiply by 3.78. And when I multiply all of that out, my units don't have to be the same because I'm multiplying. I will get centimeters cubed. And according to the calculator, I'm going to get that 12.743136. And now I'm going to do this part, the dividing. So I'm going to take this 2.703, and I'm just going to put it up here so you can see the units. And I'm going to be dividing by that 12.74. Okay? So when you plug this in, this is now where we care about the rounding and the Sig Figs. So when we plug that in, okay, so now the rules for dividing. The least Sig Figs overall. So this number up here, I see 4 Sig Figs, and this number down here, I see a lot of Sig Figs. Not even time to count it. So I know my answer needs to only have 4 Sig Figs. So when I plug this in, 2 divided by that 12, I'm going to get 0.21211, and because I only need 4 Sig Figs, I'm going to cut it right there. The number after that last one was another 1, so I'll cut it. Now what happens to the units? If you have grams divided by centimeters cubed, if they don't cancel out, then they don't cancel out. So you have to write both of them. So it's grams over centimeters cubed. Okay? So in the upcoming videos, we're going to do some more calculations with some more orders of operations, Sig Figs, and rounding. So by the time you get through all these Chapter 1, Unit 1 videos, you will be a pro of Sig Figs, moving a decimal, conversions, rounding. You will definitely understand this because it's really going to be beneficial when you get to the next chapters. I hope this helped, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll see you on the next one.